to their acknowledgement and endorsement at the global level, and eventually their implementation. High-level panelists, and I will go through and introduce them later on, will reflect on how this set of essential standards has secured official statistics trust, transparency, accountability, and relevance. The webinar will eventually discuss success stories and touch upon their possible extension, challenges, of course, in implementing the principle. It will consider specific regional and national contexts and touch upon their possible extension to the entire national data ecosystem. It will conclude with an early reflection, and I mentioned early, on possible global and regional mechanisms to monitor their implementation and follow up on non-compliance. Before introducing the panelists, and I mentioned the high-level panelists, let me say a few words. And I also studied sociology, and I think that's something that is really important. And before this seminar, when we started, we had this conversation with some of the panelists. Each community, group, association, or ethnic group has its principle, ethics, and code of behaviors. Some are written down, and some other are implicit, oral. But they help us to identify ourselves, to interact with our peers, and understand each other within our groups. It shapes how we are organized. It helps us to find our roles. But eventually, it helps outsiders, our clients, our users, to identify who we are, understand our values, build up trust and partnership. Our principles are all about that. They tell us who we are and what is our role in their society, and deliver a strong message to the outside community, the data providers, and our users. Now let me go quickly through the different panelists that we have here. The order is actually random. It's not alphabetical. And some of them actually send me a long one and ask me to shorten it. So I hope that I have shortened or I've taken away what was not important, and I kept the most important part in. We have first Dr. Ola Awad. She has been since 2009 the president of the Palestinian Bureau of Statistics, or PCBS. Ola has more than 20 years experience in statistics and was the president of the International Association for Official Statistics from 2017, IOS, from 2017 to 2019. She served as a council member in the International Statistical Institute, ISI, for the years 17 to 21. She represents the Arab region in the high-level group for partnership, coordination, and capacity building for statistics for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Dr. Ola Awad is a board member of the Statistical, Economic, and Social Research and Training Center for Islamic Countries, as well as a member of the board of trustee of the Arab Institute for Research and Training in Statistics, and a member of the Permanent Executive Committee of Statistics in the Secretariat General of the Arab League. I hope that this describes you well, Ola. I mean, of course, I could have said much more. Laura Atim is our other panelist, high-level panelist. She has over 25 years experience in public service in Seychelles, and was appointed CEO of the National Bureau of Statistics on 1st July 2010. Before that, Laura was responsible for compilation of economic statistics with emphasis on the compilation of national accounts. Laura is a statistician by education and holds a master's degree in quantitative development economics. Welcome, Laura. Marco Lavagna has been the director of the National Institute of Statistics and Census of Argentina, INDEC, since December 2019. He's also the chair of the Statistical Conference of the Americas, ECLAC, from 22, and you will hold it until 2023. He's an Argentinian economist, politician, and professor. Between 2015 and 2019, he was a national deputy for the city of Buenos Aires. Welcome, Marco. We have then Misha Belkindas, Dr. Misha. He's the present president of iOS. He's a co-founder of Open Data Watch and serves as the member of its board. Before this, as a World Bank Development Data Group Manager, he was in charge of the bank's partnership programs with national statistical offices, international organizations, donor communities, academia, and the private sector. Prior to joining the World Bank, Misha was a professor and a researcher at various prestigious universities and organizations. After that, we have, welcome Misha. After that, we have our colleague Hallgrimur Snorason, who served as Director General of Statistics Iceland from 1985 to 2007. Hallgrimur has been an active participant in international statistical cooperation, representing Iceland at the Conference of European Statisticians, and this was the case in 91. So that's why you will have a role at the beginning. The European Statistical System and the UN Statistical Commission during his tenure as head of Statistics Iceland. He was president of the International Association of Official Statistics, IOS, from 93 to 95, and the vice president of the ISI from 09 to 13. Hallgrimur retired from Statistics Iceland in 2008, taking up a career as an independent consultant in official statistics. And he's at the moment working for UNSD as a senior consultant for the fundamental principle of official statistics and related activities that would eventually bring us to the 2024 celebrations. Then, last but not least, Padraig Dalton, who joined the Central Statistical Office of Ireland in November 91. From 2007 to 2010, he was Director of Statistical Support and Innovation, and after that, Assistant Director General, Social and Demographic Statistics until 2012. Padraig was appointed Director General of the Central Statistical Office in May 2012. Padraig is a member of the Bureau of the Conference of European Statisticians, of which he was elected chair in 2021. He's also member of the UNEC High-Level Group for the Modernization of Official Statistics, serving as chair from November 13 to March 18. So welcome all panelists to that webinar, high-level webinar. I have not received actually the bio from my boss, Stefan, but he will be the first one to speak. And I will kindly ask Stefan maybe very quickly to introduce yourself and to maybe discuss a little bit about the background for this event, the role to the Commission, but also the fundamental principle celebration in 2024. What is the role of this high-level webinar? How do you see it? How can this event help us to better understand where we are going? Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you, Gabriel, for this introduction and even more, I mean, for all the preparations and you and the team. Everybody knows that when we get to this moment, there was a lot of work done in the background, and I want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. Yeah, so my name is Stefan Schweinfers. I'm the director of the UN Statistics Division, and I've been here for quite a while. I won't bore you with the other details of my life story. I think I basically only have one message at this very beginning of this webinar. I just want to share with you that I'm very happy. That I'm very happy to be connected with all of you. I mean, the global statistical community. I always felt it was a privilege to have this job and work with all of you. And I have said many times in recent times when at the United Nations they talk about the crisis of multilateralism and that the world is in a bad state, and that is certainly true. There are lots of challenges, but I always say my community, our community, the professional statisticians around the world, I'm very proud of them, also how they went through the crisis and the various crises. And like, for instance, in the COVID crisis, we kept connected through these mechanisms. But it's going to be even better to see each other soon. I'm very much looking forward to March 2023. So in a way, this event today is the curtain raiser, the appetizer, the starting shot, the ouverture, whatever metaphor does it for you. For 2023, we want to have a couple of high-level seminars, the Road to the Statistical Commission, and this one is the first one. There will be more in January and February, so watch this place. And what better topic than choosing our fundamental principles that Gabriel has so eloquently described as our language, as our business card by which we recognize each other, we recognize ourselves as a group. And in that sense, this is not only the opening to the 2023 Commission, it's actually the opening to the 2024 Commission, because in 2024 we will have two things happening. It will be the 30-year anniversary of the adoption of the fundamental principles by the Statistical Commission, and it will be the 10-year anniversary of their elevation to the General Assembly. It was interesting, just a short note, 10 years ago when we celebrated the 20-year anniversary of the principles, we ask ourselves, are the principles still okay? And we very quickly came in 2014 to the conclusion that the principles had stood the test of time. There was nothing wrong with the principles. They were as important and as relevant as ever. But one thing needed to be done, that they needed to be elevated to a commitment, not only of a professional community, that we as statisticians, data managers would adhere to these principles, but these are actually commitments by governments. So that's why we took them to the General Assembly with a new preamble, but otherwise unchanged. And in 2014, there was a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly elevating now this commitment to the fundamental principles to the level of the whole of a government. And I think that is something that is worth celebrating in 2024. Now, how are we going to celebrate in 2024? Are we just going to sit there and tap ourselves on the shoulder and feel good about ourselves? Well, we would do that also because I think we deserve it. But celebration for me is also a moment of reflection, and we can ask a number of questions. First of all, I mean, how are we doing on the fundamental principles? I mean, was each and every country able to actually implement them, or are they just a noble intention sitting on the shelf? So that how do we know that they have become a reality? What can we learn from what countries have done in the various moments of their history over the last 30 years and in the different parts of the world? How were difficulties overcome? How is it possible that we share experiences and also learn from each other, and perhaps as a United Nations Statistics Division provide some guidelines for the future? Also, there's always the difficult questions on perceived violations of the principles. We all know that there have been moments in time and some countries in the world where there was a struggle of upholding the fundamental principles, and our statistical peers were in difficult situations. What can the international community do? What can we all do to help each other and support each other? What are appropriate mechanisms? And so, and looking forward, uh, the fundamental principles, are they really only for official statistics, or are they for a much wider data space? And what carries over to the broader data ecosystem that we're all talking so much about these days? So I think these are all interesting questions that I would like to make part of our celebrations in 2024. But of course, we need to start thinking about those things. And this is why we have this event to get us going. We have a report that will be before the Statistical Commission session 2023 that will raise some of this and articulate some of those questions. And I hope to find a group of friends and like-minded people that throughout 2023 will help us to prepare the celebration in 2024. So that's where we stand right now, and I'm really happy once again with this panel because it's so diverse, it's so wonderful. I mean, experienced people from all over the world, from different types of countries, big and small, different regions of the world, different levels of development, different cultures. And I'm very excited to hear about all of their experiences, their advice, their questions. But I'm also inviting everybody else in the room to be actively part of this event. Tell us what you're thinking about. Tell us what you are worrying about. Tell us what you are happy about in your particular circumstances that could perhaps help other countries. And tell us what keeps you up at night. I think we all here together as a community to address these questions. So I'm very much looking forward to this very exciting exchange. So thanks for connecting to the panelists first and foremost, and to everybody else.
Thank you very much, Stefan. You are very enthusiastic. I mean, I just recall all of you that we have now 1 hour and 10 minutes left, right? So, and it's very important that you mentioned that everybody is welcome to comment. The chat is open to everybody. Please put your questions eventually and comments there. I'm not sure we will be able to answer them all, but at least a certain number. That's the point. We would be even able someone for a while, I mean, just to intervene in the meeting. But again, we have 1 hour and 10 minutes and we have 7 panelists. So this is important. Now, again, all this sounds like a fairy tale. And I have organized this webinar a little bit around a few topics. And the first one that I have here, it's once upon a time. Right, so I mean, maybe we can start. I mean, with Hallgrimur. Hallgrimur, you were member of the Conference of European Statisticians in.
Oh yes, and of course, I'm being the dinosaur of this group. I'm asked to go back to these almost 100 years in my mind. Okay, 30 years.
I mean, can you please tell us, I mean, to set a little bit the context of the adoption of the principle by the Conference of European Statisticians?
I shall. You have to cast your minds back to the years late 1980s and early 1990s. The breakdown of the Soviet system and the breakdown of the centrally planned economies at that time. Now, at this time, we had basically 2 statistical systems in the world, so to speak. We had the system organized by the UN and the Bretton Woods institutions around market economic systems, and we had the system organized around centrally planned economies and social systems of the Soviet Union and the similar countries. Now, that system broke down, the latter one. So when that system broke down, the system of centrally planned government systems in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, that led to a breakdown of the statistical system of the same countries. And that presented those countries with great difficulties. And then the basic difficulty was a near total lack of trust in official statistics, near total lack of trust. And of course, you know, this is what we have been battling with all our times, is that to maintain trust in our statistics. Here it was this question of how can we build trust? And the reply given by the statisticians around this time was that we need to create this trust. We need to have a fundamental change in attitude and outlook towards statistics, away from the enforced data collection to fulfill planning targets, towards voluntary surveys among respondents based on legislations laying down basic rules for official statistical operations. So this task was then approached by a number of statisticians in Central Europe and Eastern Europe and the Conference of European Statisticians in 1990 and 1991. There were several meetings, first informal and then formal meetings under the auspices of the Conference of European Statisticians. And this ended up by the compilation of the 10 commandments, of the fundamental principles, 10 commandments. And perhaps it was not quite a coincidence that there were 10. It is clear that when people started talking about what should these principles involve, and there were a number of ideas, etc. And we came up with long texts, which were gradually shortened to short texts, more or less bullet points, and to a short number of principles. So we have our 10 commandments agreed on in 1991, and then adopted at the ministerial level by the Economic Commission for Europe in 1992, and then adopted by the Statistical Commission in 1994. So this is a kind of a brief history and the context.
Thank you very much, Haldemar. That's of course very, very useful to understand where we are coming from, right? But we had already kind of code of ethics at that time, and we had these one from the ISI. We had the ISI Declaration on Professional Ethics. These one were not probably sufficient. In what are they different? Misha, can you explain a little bit what are the main differences between actually the ISI Declaration on Professional Ethics, that is an important code for us too, and the principles that were just like presented by Haldemar at the moment?
Thank you very much. I mean, when you started, Gabriel, you said that every community, and you said that you are looking at it as a sociologist, has some principles why they are together. And that is true also for statisticians. So if we look at the fundamental, at the professional ethics declaration of the ISI, it says that the aim of this declaration is to enable the statisticians' individual ethical judgments and decisions to be informed by shared values and experience, rather by rigid rules imposed by the profession. So we are talking about individuals. We're talking about individuals, and then the declaration goes on and talks about shared professional values, which is respect, professionalism, truthfulness and integrity. And then it talks about ethical principles, which is pursuing objectivity, clarifying obligations and roles, assessing alternatives, conflicts of interest, avoiding preempted outcomes, exhibiting professional competence, maintaining confidence in statistics, communicating ethical principles, and the last one is protective the interest of subjects. And when we go to, as Haldemar called it, the commandments, and I also remember the nice days of the Conference of European Statisticians in the early 90s, because the statistical system, the countries which joined the World Statistical Community, they at the same time joined the World Bank, and we at the World Bank, people had to work with them, started to work with them, so to help them to move from the systems of in centrally planned economies to the system of national accounts, and introduce surveys and the consumer price index, and you name it, and that's when this fundamental principles were extremely important. That the whole world of statistics speaks at the same language, speaks as not only as professionals, individual professionals, but as organizations. So that's why I would say that both the Declaration of Professional Ethics and Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics, they kind of overlap somewhere, but they are different, and they are both important. So I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Misha. Now we understand clearly that one is not superseding the other one. They are actually complementary. One more on the professionals, I mean on the statistician individual, and one more of the group as official statisticians. Thank you very much. That, I think it was an important point. Now, if we started once upon a time, and what about now? And you, Padraig, as the chair of the bureau of the Conference of European Statisticians, you have been also involved in some events that were organized by the Conference of European Statisticians, by UNECE, last summer, and I would ask you, what are the main outcome or findings that came out of that? Are the values and ethics embedded in the principle for official statistics still relevant? Is there something that we learned from the pandemic? I believe these were important points that were discussed during these events.
Yeah, very much so, Gabrielle, and I think there's an awful lot of good work still going on. Just very briefly, I think the thing about the principles for me is that whoever drafted them, and I think Haldrum or you were involved, and maybe one of my predecessors was involved, but I think our predecessors did a fantastic job in developing the fundamental principles, because principles should be timeless in many ways, and I think they are timeless. And I think, Stefan, you mentioned in your introduction, you reviewed them in 2014 to consider if they were still relevant, and the finding was that they are. And my sense of it is today that they are still incredibly relevant. So the simple answer is yes. And I always think about the fundamental principles as being like a lighthouse on a headland. It's always there. It guides you when you're in good times, but it's particularly useful when you're in a bit of a fog or in a storm. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, the fundamental principles reflect our default behavior. So when you come under pressure, you default to your default behavior. And I think that that's where the fundamental principles have really become so important, because I think they represent, for the global community, what our default behavior is when we come under pressure. And we came under pressure during the pandemic, Gabrielle. You're absolutely right. We had to either step up and be relevant, or we could say we can't do anything and be totally irrelevant. But that didn't happen. If you think about it, we focused on things about being relevant. So we all stepped up. We started producing really important data around the number of cases, around mortality, around excess mortality and things like that. And we produced that data in an impartial and an objective way. And so I think, and we made that data as accessible to the decision makers as we did to the public. And I think the pandemic has been a fantastic opportunity for the global statistical community to show how we live the principles, the principle of relevance. We were relevant, we were impartial, the equality of access. There was total transparency around what we were doing. And we also, if you think about it, we were coordinating across the system, because the data we needed to compile the statistics didn't come from primary data sources. It came from the health institutions who we were all working with. And I think for all, if you think about all of those things, we were agile, we were resilient. Public service really came to the fore, and data was used to drive decisions. And I just think that data wouldn't have been used to drive the decisions if the decision makers didn't trust the data, and if the public didn't trust the data. And I think there was that kind of real kind of coming together of decision maker and citizen all using and seeing the same information and realizing, my God, this has been pulled together by professionals who act in an objective and an impartial way. In other words, we behaved and we lived the principles, and that's the key. And for me, fundamentally, you can break everything down to that one word, Gabrielle, and you use it at the start, is trust. If we live it's not the existence of the fundamental principles that matter. It's the fact that we live the fundamental principles. And I think that's what embeds trust. And for me, they are as relevant today as they were back in 1991 when I joined the community of official statisticians as a young statistician in the CSO.
Gabrielle, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patrick. It's nice to hear that these principles, that usually we understand principles as something that make us a little bit stubborn, make us a little bit dusty. Actually, not at all. They made us agile and resilient, and thank the trust that we had. We have been able to produce and actually deliver our important data and statistics to the community in those very, very difficult days. Now, let's go one step maybe further. I mean, of course, the principles, also as mentioned at the beginning, help us to shape or to develop national statistical systems from the institutional and organizational perspective that are more or less a little bit similar because they have an impact on how we build them up. Have this increased the interoperability between these different national statistical systems? And if so, did this stimulate regional or maybe even global cooperation? How do you see the fundamental principles as also an important element in regional and global cooperation? Maybe Ola, what is the situation in the Arab states, for example? I think Ola is no more with us.
Yes, no, I mean,
oh yeah, she is. Okay, sorry.
No, thank you, Gabriel. Yeah, the fundamental principles of official statistics constitute the common principles that regulate official statistics, and thus they are the common ground where community of all statistics meet. Fundamental principles of official statistics are common reference for the national statistical system as they support the implementation of the national statistics for the development, the national strategy for the development of statistics, coordination mechanism, a flow of admin record, data, joint dissemination initiatives, and even data collection activities. In addition, the fundamental principles of official statistics are also a cornerstone for the technical cooperation at the regional and international level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola. Maybe Marco, as the chair of the Conference of the Americas, you can also tell us a little bit something about how this helps also in terms of cooperation or regional cooperation in Latin America. You're muted, Marco.
Thanks. First, thank you for the invitation. Let me begin with the Statistical Conference of America, contribute to improve the production, dissemination, data harmonization, and coordination in the region. We do this through training courses, seminars, and other capacity building activities. Of course, TECLAC is our support, technical support, and secretary, and it's real important the coordination and the cooperation that we have, and probably since the pandemic, this got stronger, the cooperation and the coordination that we have. In 2019, I think I'm not mistaken in the data, the Statistical Conference of America approved a generic law for official statistics that include of course, the fundamental principles. This was really important to adapt the national, the United Nations model to adapt to the region. I think that gives us a strong tool to improve and to adapt these fundamental principles. Of course, the purpose of this was to provide a region, a model to those countries who were interested in formulating or reformulating the legal basis for the foundation of their national statistics system. The generic law, of course, that defines the rights, the obligations of the bodies that compose all the national systems. And let me say that this was really difficult. In 2020, the IDB published a really interesting study, comparative, that when they compared 18 countries most of them speaking Spanish speaking, except from Brazil, that give us the idea of the difficulty of the region to have this kind of model, this kind of generic law. We have of course, all of the countries has a presidential system. All of the countries has a continental legal system, but most have a unitary state, except for 4 countries that have federal states: Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Venezuela. And half of the country has a unicameral legislative system. The other half, of course, have a bicameral. And in some cases, the region has high dispersions of regulations that make their interoperations very difficult. And most of the law has several years. So we have a lot of margin to improve in this sense. We have a lot to incorporate from the fundamentals. And I think that the Statistical Conference of America is a really strong tool that we have in terms of cooperation and how to adapt these fundamentals and to incorporate them in all the laws. It's very weird to find the fundamentals and probably also codes of good practices in the current laws in Latin America. So it's really important, this generic law that we approved in the 10th meeting, and how we work now in terms of adapt this generic law. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Marco. And of course, I'm very proud for having contributed actually to the development of this regional gloss for Latin America. But one point that is important from the discussion is that the fundamental principles are an integral part or contribute to the common business architecture. This is something that is important. Again, we come back to that. It helps to cooperate, coordinate, exchange tools, methods, concepts, because we are based on similar fundamental rules. And this is something that is important. And of course, at regional level, where it's more homogeneous than the global one, this makes probably even more sense. And thank you very much, Marco, for your intervention. Laura, I mean, well, we have been discussing at regional level, different kind of size of countries. It was mentioned by Stefan. Are these principles serving their purposes also in a small island development state? Are these principles important? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Okay, thank you, Gabriel. Yes, looking at the principles, I would say yes, but just from a different perspective, coming from a small island state. You know, when the principles were drafted by the, if I may put the big boys, the experts in Europe at the UN, etc., as a small island developing state, or I suppose I'm also sort of like speaking for other small countries, it was like all these principles or all these manuals or all the things being drafted overseas by the experts, by the big countries. Where do small island states fit in there? Like, it's not something for us. But at the end of the day, we are all one big statistical family, having sort of like basically the same functions, you know. Perhaps we're at different speeds of development, different levels of development, but nonetheless, we have to abide by the first speaker, I think, said the 10 commandments. At the end of the day, I look at it as, okay, this is our constitution. This is what we have to do. So as a small island developing state, we were not really making reference to the fundamental principles of official statistics. But nonetheless, as Patrick has said, it's not about the existence of these principles, of this constitution, but it's actually living it. So at the end of the day, we find ourselves doing what we're supposed to do and trying to conform with what is required of the principles, although we're not referring to it. But at the end of the day, when we look at it, we see that, yes, they are still relevant because they lay down the principles, you know, guiding us on how to do our work. Although as a small island developing state, perhaps in the past we said, okay, we have to do our population census, we have to do surveys, we've got good data on this, we are collecting economic stats. where does the fundamental principles of official statistics come in? But then when we look at it, we are respecting confidentiality. We are looking at, we have a law in place for that, the accountability and transparency. Although there are some challenges that small island states would face in fully complying with those principles. But I would say on a broad level, at a broad level, I would say that they are still relevant irrespective of the size of the country. It is a constitution, it is our guiding principle, our guiding framework. So I think it's still relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That's very good to hear, right? I mean, that they apply, whatever the size of the country or the way we are organized and so on, they apply to us as a family in a way, right? As official statisticians. I mean, maybe we can continue directly with you because you have a new statistical law. Congratulations, first of all. But at country level, at your level, what are the lessons learned in translating the principles into statistical legislation? What could be considered for a country like yours as a good practice? But maybe in order not to make it only a beauty contest, because we said maybe what are the lessons learned? Also, these one maybe that you would advise others not to do, right? When you translate these principles into legislation. Laura, please.
All right. Okay, thanks. So when we were drafting the new law, the revision in our law, we realized that, okay, the fundamental principles existed, but in all previous laws, there was a gap. There was no mention of the fundamental principles of official statistics, and all the laws in the past were drafted solely to address the operations of the Bureau. It was like the national statistical system did not fit anywhere in the law. Although we know that official statistics goes much beyond the NSO itself. Of course, the NSO would be at the apex, sort of like the body assisting the NSS, but the others wouldn't find themselves in the law. So with the fundamental principles of official statistics, it has a special place in the preliminary section of the law, and also in other sections where it actually sort of like, and it even appears at the end of the document as a schedule. So it's there. And when we were drafting the new act, we consulted with the other sectors within the country that form part of the NSS, and we're trying to promote and sensitize the other sectors of these principles so that within their own operations, they respect, on all these principles, the ethical standards, the how to collect the data, the legislation that we have, the coordination that needs to exist between the Bureau and themselves, how we have to use international standards to try and harmonize the way that we do things. So the fundamental principles sort of like are embedded in the law and will guide the other sectors as well to see themselves applying this. So it's not something that is one-sided. Only the Bureau is abiding by these principles, which are important to get the trust of the users, but they are also part and parcel of this whole process. As the national statistical system, it's now laid down in the law. So I think we've got a good package to get everybody on board and everybody to sort of like follow the route and use this as our constitution and as our 10 commandments in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Marco, I mean, you are also in the process, if I'm correct, of revising your statistical legislation. Do you have something to add? Is your experience a little bit the same? What are you, I mean, good lessons learned? Please, Marco, if you want to take the floor. Marco?
Sorry, yeah. I was having a problem with the connection. Sorry. Well, first, let me congratulate Laura for the law. Also, let me congratulate Paraguay that they just approved a new law. So it's good to mention the country that has new legislation. In our case, in Argentina, our current law is from 1968, more than 50 years ago. And don't get me wrong, it was a good law. It's a good law. It's still a good law. Of course, it doesn't have the fundamental principles, of course, but it allowed the index to become a leading case in Latin America. But for us, it was a moment to modernize our law, and so we present to the president. We are waiting to him to sign it and send it to the Congress. A new law, a new project, which of course include the experience that we acquire in the exchange with the international statistical community. Of course, that include the fundamental principles. Of course, that includes the independence. We include something regarding to the access to new data, like register administratives, to become those an obligation to share with the Institute of Statistics. And we are working on now once the president presents the law, we are working with the Congress also. You know that it's very important to, and probably this is also a recommendation, it's really important to find the correct moment to present this kind of law. It's difficult to present a law that has the whole approval of a bicameral like we have in our system. And we need to be very clear in terms of the importance of maintaining the fundamental principles or some key issues in the law. So probably, Stefan, I'm going to ask you for some help once we go to the Congress, that I believe it's going to be very helpful for us to find some experience in terms of international experience to help us to explain the importance of the incorporation of this kind of laws and the fundamental principles. So we are working on that. We are very confident in that we are going to have a new law rather than sooner than later. But this will take us a lot of work and a lot of coordination then with the federal system. In Argentina, we have a federal system. And once we have the national law, our commitment or our challenge is how to bring the national law to the federal system, and how the federal institutes adopt these fundamental principles. This is our line of work that we are going to try to accomplish.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that, and also to mention that the organization of the state in the federal state, you have to push down, if I can call it like that. You have to push down the principles and the statistical legislation also at the other levels, so that we all play according to the same rules, right, within the country. And this is, of course, a point that is very important. I come myself from a federal state, so I know what exactly it means. Ola, do you want to add something about that, and also how these principles are incorporated or embedded in the statistical legislation?
Thank you, Gabriel. First, let me congratulate Laura and Paraguay for the new law. That's really amazing. For us, I mean, it's been a while. We worked jointly together with the Halfmer on updating our statistical law. And although I may say it's taking us really too much time to endorse it, but nevertheless, I mean, my intervention, I may say, I can answer a pivotal concern. To what extent a strong and flexible Statistics Act influenced the development and modernization of the NSOs? The Statistics Act is the backbone for the national statistical offices, and that is why should be in line with good practices and adaptive to increasing demands of users and stakeholders. Nevertheless, the practice of NSOs on the ground, for me and from our learning experience, is what matters. You can hide behind the Statistics Act if you are against modernization. In the same token, you can bypass legal barriers imposed by the law if you are open-minded and pro-modernization. If I want to take, for example, Palestine case as an example, in the law it says PCBS is only allowed to disseminate statistical tables. Narrow interpretation will not support the dissemination of microdata and thus will leave PCBS behind in terms of development and openness. Broader interpretation relies on the end goal, which is to produce statistical tables, and this applies that you can disseminate microdata sets and any other ways of dissemination. After all, it was the National Statistical Organization decision either to hide behind the Statistics Act or utilize it to serve us in the NSO better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola. Yes, and actually it brings me to the next question that I had. I mean, is it all about the legislation? Are there other ways of national or at national and international levels, but in particular at national one, to promote the principle and make sure that the different partners are behaving and producing statistics and data according to these principles? Is it all about the law? I don't know, Patrick, do you want to intervene there? Because you have a slightly different system, right?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully we have a very strong piece of legislation. But I think actually strong legislation is absolutely a key fundamental foundation for official statistics, for an effective official statistical system. But of course, on its own, it's not enough. We have legislation, we have the fundamental principles, which I think are also incredibly important. We have core values, but it's never about one thing. And if you think about it, like for me, it's always about trust. When you bring it all down to when you boil it down to what it's about, is we all spend every day compiling official statistics that we feel are answering the questions of decision makers, and also making sure that citizens and the people that live in our countries live in an informed society. And that's really what we're about. But if the decision makers or the public don't trust what we're producing, well, then it's an absolute waste of time. It's a waste of taxpayers' money, and it's not being effective, right? So trust is the key thing for me. And trust is not engendered through the existence of legislation or through the existence of fundamental principles that could sit on a shelf or through the existence of core values. What builds trust is compliance with legislation, living the core values, living the principles. So I think what we have to increasingly focus on is just think about what are the foundations, and it's not one thing. So it's not just about the behaviors either. So if you have really strong behaviors, but you don't have a strong piece of statistical legislation, that's not going to work either, right? So it's a complicated environment we work and we live in. We're trying to measure an economy that's moving really quickly. We're measuring a society that's totally changing. And by the way, how people live is changing, how they get their information, how they get their data is changing. So we have to constantly evolve and change, but some things have to stay the same. And for me, that's the grounding of the legislation and the principles and the core values. But our behaviors, I think, that's the place I think we have to focus at the minute, Gabriel, on how we make sure we kind of build that trust. Because I worry about things like fake news and alternative facts. And we don't have to look too far to see how quickly fake news and alternative facts can undermine democracy and undermine society. It's actually frightening how quickly it can take hold. And I think that we as an official statistical system, we're the counterbalance to all of that. And we have to see ourselves as that. And we can't relinquish our responsibilities in that regard to any other compilers of statistics. I mean, you think about that. Let's say we relinquish it to parts of the private sector. They have, no matter what way you go about it, private sector will always have an agenda at some stage. But we are official statisticians. We have no agenda other than to work in the public good. So very quickly, Gabriel, and sorry for going on a bit about it, but it's not all about legislation. But legislation is absolutely key. But it's a whole mix of things. And for me, the best way to promote the principles is to live the principles. It's to be relevant, to be impartial, to be transparent. And I think if we do that, we will produce statistics that people will trust and people will believe in. And that, in a sense, if we can highlight that the reason we do all of this is because of the public interest and because we live by the principles, well, then we'll be promoting the principles. And I think we do it by example.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I mean, it was, I think, a very, very important point. I don't know if Misha and Stefan, do you want, since you have not been, and then I will give the floor to Hallgrímur. He raised his hand, and of course you can do the same if you want really to intervene. Yeah, I don't know. Stefan, do you want to say something about that? No, it's okay. Misha, do you want to say? Okay, otherwise we go, yeah, go ahead, because you were on the list, yeah, and then Hallgrímur.
Just a few things. I mean, I agree with what Patrick said, but, you know, I mean, the ecosystem is changing. And, you know, we have many more actors in the system. We have good ones and bad ones. And so we have to live with it and see how the national statistical organizations, national statistical systems absorb and work with it. And what worries me is, you know, it's a big problem with the trust and in statistics, with use and misuse of data. And this is extremely important, and we need to show by example what's happening. And, you know, that's why IAOS has created the Krakow Working Group, which is working on that. And we work together with ISI and other colleagues. And we hope, you know, that we will come up with some principles, you know, developed by the Krakow Working Group, which will be useful in this environment. And also what I wanted to add, and I think Patrick said that, you know, we are producing statistics not for the sake of statistics. We are producing statistics for the use of it. And what worries me at all, that the national statistical systems are producing statistics as a public good. And in many countries, and I am not afraid to say, the governments do not use statistics for their policy making, for their decision making. And I think this is extremely important. You know, the budget pays for it, the government, the Minister of Finance approves the budget, and then they turn around and they don't use that public good, which they have to use for their decision making. And I think this is extremely important, and we have to work with the data users, many more, to let them understand that, you know, that is important and that they have to use, and these data are produced according to legislation and according to the fundamental principles of official statistics. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Misha. Also, because I saw in the chat that we had a few comments going in that direction. Also, the statistical literacy is something that is important. And I think that also Patrick explained that we have to explain how we are working, right, and build up on trust. I mean, people need to use statistics that are not used are not useful. So basically, this is a fundamental point. Hallgrímur, I mean, you raise your hand, so please, the floor is yours.
Yes,
Shortly,
I would just perhaps like to reinforce what Patrick said, and I'm very much in agreement with what he said. I mean, legislation is not sufficient. We have to comply with the legislation we have, and we have to live the fundamental principles. And I have, in fact, quite an experience of that from my old days, because I only got a new legislation for my country in my very last year of service. Before that, I was relying on a very old legislation. And then you can imagine the great relief when the fundamental principles came about in 1991, 1992, that this has enabled me to live without proper legislation for many, many, many years, and explain to government, etc. And then comes my point, perhaps, that I can add to what Patrick said, and that is not enough to live the principles. It's not enough to follow them. You also have to tell people that you are living them and that you are following them, etc. You have to proclaim it. You have to advertise yourself and say, this is what we do, and that's according to these principles, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hallgrimur. Ola, you also raise your hand, please.
Thank you. I mean, Hallgrimur mentioned it. It's really important. In addition to legislation, it's not all about legislation, and I fully agree with Patrick. And as Hallgrimur mentioned, it's also about the NSO visibility, the reputation, the trust and practices on the ground. This is so much important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we can see that even in the GSPPM. Our production process starts by not collecting data as many think, but consulting the users and trying to identify what are their needs. And this is something that is important, makes us probably different than the others, because we start first by thinking what others, and not us, need for information in order to take a decision. But of course, this is also something we have to better communicate, and I think it was an important point. And just very quickly, my role is also to help countries to develop their statistical legislation. And in many countries, once we have the new law adopted, then they tell me now we are a modern statistical system. I say, no, that's only the starting point. Now you have to behave accordingly, right? And take the lead. So this is important. Now we have also, I think that Laura also wanted to speak. It's a very popular point. So go ahead, Laura.
Thank you, Gabriel. Yes, just to add on to what has been said regarding, okay, as legislation, I'll go beyond and say, like, even when NSOs are drafting their strategic plans, you know, when we drafted our strategic plan, we had this consultation process, because it's not only about us as producers, but we also need to know about the users, be it other sectors who are using our data and who perhaps themselves are also producers of the data. So we had this consultation process to find out about their institutional environment, to find out what it is that they were doing. So in a way, it was kind of promoting statistics, making them, sensitizing them about the fundamental principles. And also when we get everybody on board, it sort of like builds the trust and we come together. So in the strategic plan as well, the users are there and they get to know about the importance of statistics. So it goes beyond just the legislation, but the strategic plan sort of like is also put in together as a package. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that. So the principles are important for us, but they're also important for the others to understand exactly what is our role. And sometimes we have to make a greater or bigger efforts in order to communicate these principles and exactly what is our role in the society and in what we might be different from other producer of data or statistics. So we will have to skip a couple of the topics or questions that we had prepared, but we have seen now that these principles are fundamental, and that's why we call them fundamental principles, right? But we also know that they are not always implemented properly. So what could be the mechanisms and tools at regional, maybe even global levels to monitor the implementation of the principles and, as appropriate, react to infringements of these principles? I mean, since they are important, we want to help the others also to implement them properly, right? So what kind of mechanisms could be, maybe already exist or could be developed to better monitor and react to these kind of infringements? Maybe Misha, come, yeah, as ISI and iOS.
Thank you. I mean, you know, I understand that, you know, iOS and ISI as NGOs actually have much more kind of freedom. You know, I remember when I worked at the World Bank, you know, I tried to have, let's say, an index of statistical capacity. And immediately when we put it up on the board, we got a kind invitation to some of the executive directors who didn't like it. So, you know, so that's why, you know, in my career, we created the Open Data Watch, where we can talk what we think and what we think is right. But at this point, you know, it's very important that there are such groups like ISI and IOS, which can you know, step up when we see that the fundamental principles are violated, and mostly that is, you have two issues to tackle. One is when we see and we can justify that some statistical serious data are produced just wrong, and you know, and I think we have the duty to approach the statisticians and to explain that this is wrong. We don't have too much of a mechanism of, you know, a watchdog which could tell us, and it's probably impossible to have it, but you know, in some cases, you know, these things happen. And the second case is the mistreatment of statisticians, you know, and we see it. You know, unfortunately, I can say that we see it more and more. And in the last couple of years, where ISI together with IOS, or just ISI alone or IOS alone, we have raised these issues, and you know, we didn't get replies from the presidents of the countries where we sent our letters. But at least I think we, you know, we put it on the website, and you know, ISI and IOS, and you know, and people react. People, you know, the statisticians feel that there is somebody who can speak up for them if they are in trouble. So let me stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha. Yeah, yes, it reminds me also a couple of things, like, for example, a country that just implemented, actually, I mean, got and endorsed a new statistical legislation with a tenure of 7 years for the chief statistician. And I was going to the country there to help them to implement that, to put it into practice. And when I landed there, I had another chief statistician in front of me. So we had a law, but the law was unfortunately not respected, right? And this is something that is important. Ola, you want also to react on that, and then Patrick? Ola, please. Ola, you are muted. And it seems that the communication, I mean, the connection is not so good, but go ahead.
Yeah, I strongly believe that, I mean, being as NSO, it's kind of a learning experience and learning organization. And there are so many best practices that we exchange between the countries on the best tools and mechanism, and even on the global level, with so many projects that has been taken place globally. And this was actually a way of, you know, having so many regional and a global cooperation and global projects that also serve the countries, and being really a kind of good mechanism to monitor. So I strongly believe that, I mean, being adaptive and responsive and being within the learning mechanism, this can give you more kind of learning on different aspects to monitor the implementation of the principles. And I may add just one thing, that, I mean, after the pandemic, I mean, within the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, the majority of the NSOs proved to be able to adapt and be part of the solution, not the problem. So what was the trick to be adopted? The answer is to be a learning organization and modernization as a continuous process. This is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ola. Patrick, do you want to complement, add something?
Yeah, just very quickly, Gabrielle, just I mean, I remember many years ago reading the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report about beyond GDP, and there was a line in it that said, you know, what we measure determines what we do. Now, if we think about what we're talking about now, is what we monitor can influence our behavior. So I think that concept of monitoring is quite important. And you know, if you just look at what we do within the European statistical system, and I see Walter Rademacher is tuned in, but you know, Ireland this year, well, sorry, all NSIs across Europe were currently being peer reviewed by a team of independent experts, and it's an organised and structured process through the European Commission, through Eurostat, and we were peer reviewed. I think it was in February of this year, but it's a really good exercise. Because the fact that you know you're going to be peer reviewed means that, you know, it does keep you on your toes, which is really good. Not that we need it, but I do think it's having an external driver sometimes isn't a bad thing. But I think there's an uncomfortable truth for us though, okay? And that is, okay, the peer reviewers are great, but even outside of the peer reviews, we can all see that there are things happening that shouldn't happen, right? Right across. And what happens? What's happening? Misha, you referenced it. You wrote letters to X, Y, and Z, and nothing happened. So we can monitor and we can highlight, but the question is, what happens? And that's an uncomfortable question and an uncomfortable truth for all of us, because very often it's not the fault of the NSI, as you know. It's not the NSI is what is at stake. It's much bigger than that, and it's higher than the NSI. And who holds those to account, and who's going to influence those people to kind of change their behavior? I don't think that the statistical community can. So I'd really be interested in views around that, because it's one of the things that does bother me, because we have all highlighted, you know, we've all seen uncomfortable things happening to colleagues over the last, you know, it's been going on for a long time, but I've certainly, you know, I've seen it myself in the last number of years, and it's an uncomfortable position to be in, where you want to do something and you try to do something and you try to support somebody, but words are words, you know. We have to think about actions. And then the second thing, I don't know, in the chat you'll see a little bit there that's about, you know, I think Walter made a good point about it. It's not just
we will give him the floor. I mean, if Walter is still with us, I wanted him just to intervene very quickly after, just for you to know. Okay, very good.
Okay.
And Walter, if you are here with us, raise your hand so that we can identify you in this long list of participants, so that we can promote you as a full participant. Sorry, Patrick.
No, but the second point then is about Walter was mentioning about not just about the behaviors of the statistical community, but about the behaviors of users of data. And I think one of the models I like is in the UK, where they have an organization, the National Statistics Authority, whose responsibility actually it is to call out misuse and of data. And I've seen where they've called out the Prime Minister at times. Now, it doesn't mean that data isn't misused from time to time still in the UK, but at least now they know there's somebody watching, and that certainly is going to influence behavior. It mightn't eliminate it, but I certainly think it is a really interesting model that they have in the UK, and something that's certainly worth reflecting on. So sorry for taking so much time.
No, thank you very much, Patrick. And I'm wondering, and I will give the floor to Marco, I'm wondering if the idea of identifying and mentioning a country that is not following or implementing the fundamental principle is just to blame the country and to put that country on the shame list, or if at the end it's not to try to resolve the issue and actually to start a cooperation so that the country is implementing and following the principles. And as you mentioned, it's not all about the statisticians, because usually we know the principles and we like them, but it's again, how do we explain them to our policymakers, the government, etc. Marco, please.
Thank you, Gabriel. I was going to say something really similar at what you said just now. It's really important for us to work in terms of the communication. Of course, that for us, the fundamental principles are there. We work under them. We like them, as you said. But it's us. The idea is how we make that the users make their own the principles. And for that, we need a lot of communication. Patrick says something about fake news and probably social medias also. And we have to know that we have to adapt our way to communicate with the users and acknowledge the new reality that we have, and we have to face it. That is the only way that I think that we are going to be able to ensure the compliance of the fundamental instrument. Of course, that we all are technicians, we work independent, but independent, it doesn't mean that we are to be isolated. So we have to have a lot of communication with the political side or the executive power or the other users. I think that was Misha that mentioned something about the use of the data that we produce. And this is really important. We have to explain, we have to communicate better in terms of that every user realizes the importance of the fundamental principles. And also the way that we show the data. Of course, that we can give a lot of bases with a lot of numbers, really nice charts, but not every user are able to understand all that kind of numbers and data. We have to be able to show the data in easier ways, probably here with maps, with geo statistics. We have to work in communication. And of course, I don't like the idea of make a blacklist with countries that don't work with the fundamental. I think that we have to work in terms of the cooperation.
Thank you very much, Marco. Patrick, you also put something in the chat, right? You also agree with that. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Ola, did you raise your hand once again, or is it from before?
It's from before, sorry.
Okay, no problem. But a point that is very important there is that, and sometimes there were a little bit of confusion about that, independence does not mean isolation, right? So, I mean, we have to communicate, and we have the right, we have even the obligation. This is our mandate. We have to understand the users. So we need to be independent, but we need to be open and have a dialogue with our users and data providers. So this is something that is of course fundamental. And I think we all agree that the objective of identifying misuse of statisticians, infringement to the fundamental principles is not to blame or just to blame. It is to help eventually the country to implement the principles correctly. So we have there, I would say, a common duty here, and the international and the regional organizations probably share that one, to help others when we notice that there are infringements, to help others to align themselves with the fundamental principles. If that's it, I don't see Walter on the list anymore. Sorry, Alex. Walter is no more here, right? Probably.
I cannot find him in the list, so if he doesn't raise his, it only shows like 70 participants, and then I cannot see the rest of the list. So Walter, if you are still with us, please raise your hand so I can easily find you.
Otherwise, I mean, we can go because he was the most active, right? We got a couple of points here that we discussed, but I mean, and thank you very much to the participants. It helped us a little bit to shape the questions. But I mean, Walter had a couple of interventions that I found rather interesting, and Patrick was also trying to answer him right through the chat. But now let's come to the last point. We have to, unfortunately, the extension of the principles to the entire data ecosystem. Are the principles entirely or partially applicable to the data ecosystem? Should they be extended as such or adapted? Or are other sets of principles more appropriate? And what would be the point for us to develop and to try to enforce principles to the entire data community? What is our final objective? Because one thing is good to have a tool, but we have to think what is the purpose of that tool. So I don't know who wants to answer first to that question. Misha, maybe? ISI again?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I just want to say that, of course, several of you were in back in April in Krakow, where we had a day when we discussed the fundamental principles and some other issues. But during the discussion of fundamental principles, we had we tried to bring in the broader community, the other data producers outside the official statistical system. And what people are saying, they're saying we work by our principles. We don't work without principles. We have principles which guide us. Now the question is how compatible they are. And I really do not feel that we need to do a lot with the fundamental principles that they are now, but we should keep discussing it, and see is there a tweak needed, or they are good as they are, and they are so fundamental that we cannot touch them. But I think this is what we should keep discussing, and hopefully in 2024 we can say that we made this little change, or we don't need to make a change, and we reconfirm that they are really fundamental and untouchable. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Misha. Padraig has, Padraig, please.
Yeah, thanks. Just two observations. I think at the start I said that I think the principles are still relevant today, and I'd be very slow to change the principles, because I think it's one of the things we need to retain stability on. But I do think it's a good question to ask, and it's useful to reflect on it. I suppose there are two things that I might mention, and I'd be interested in people's observations on that. The first one relates to Principle 2, where we're talking about professional ethics. And I think, as you all know now, part of the conversation that's going on around the official statistical system is actually about data ethics. And I'm wondering, to what extent is there a difference between professional ethics and data ethics? Because this data ethics has emerged in the context of the greater usage of secondary data sources, the issues of where we're now using multiple data sources to create outputs. Data linkage and integration is becoming important at micro data level. The issue of behaving ethically about how we link and how we integrate the data, how we do that in a way that's consistent with privacy laws that exist. Obviously in Europe it's the General Data Protection Regulation, and so the emergence of data ethics is something that's quite interesting. My sense is the principle of it, or the spirit of it, is captured within Principle 2, but it's just a question there, because I know Misha, you mentioned the concept of professional ethics at the start, and I was in a meeting yesterday actually where we were talking about professional ethics and data ethics and whether or not there was a difference. And it's something that I don't know enough about, but I'd be quite interested to hear other people's opinions. But I don't think it would be enough of a reason to change or to amend the fundamental principles. The second piece that's on my mind is about this coordination. It's Principle 8, and Principle 8 talks about coordination among statistical agencies within our national boundaries, and that is absolutely correct. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But I think now, if you think about what we're all doing, is we are now coordinating beyond statistical organizations within our countries, or a lot of us are. We're coordinating amongst the custodians of administrative data in particular. We're making sure that we're providing them with we're providing data services to them. We're making sure that they're using the appropriate unique identifiers so that we can link and integrate data across the system. We're making sure they're using the same classifications. We're making sure that they're implementing quality management frameworks. And of course, part of the reason they're willing to work with us on this is that it's not just improving the data for official statistical purposes, it's actually improving the data for their own purposes. And I think so the rising tide, if you like, is lifting all the boats from a data perspective. So I don't know that we need to amend the fundamental principles for that, but it is one of the emerging things. It's this increased coordination role that we have across the systems, not just across other organizations in our systems that are compiling statistics, but it's increasingly that coordination role. And I think particularly for us at the moment anyway, it's across the civil and public service and across civil and public service data holdings and coordinating data activities there. Actually, that's quite interesting. So they're the two things I'd reference, but my overall sense is actually I'd be very slow. I really like the fundamental principles. I think they still reflect the core values. I think they reflect the behaviors. I think they really provide that lighthouse piece for us, and I'd be quite slow to change it. But they're the two pieces that I think that just came into my mind when I was asked the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We should not change a winning team, right? So I mean, they have been extremely useful, these principles, and you're telling us that we have to be very careful. That's the point, right? Before changing them, because the risk is that we get something that is worse than what we are having now, and they're rather good. When it comes to this code of ethics, or code of how you say, of professional ethics or data ethics. Who, I mean, do you think should then deliver a stamp, a quality stamp, or an ethics stamp to these actors in the data ecosystem? Is it the statistical office that would have this task to do that? So basically, to assess, review, and then eventually give a stamp as yes, you are following these principles or these ethics. I don't know if someone want to answer to that question, Patrick.
I shouldn't have said anything. You've come back to me with a really difficult question, actually. I think the fundamental principles, and I think the data piece is different to the data ethics piece, if you know what I'm saying. I think data ethics it's a broader context, and I think it has to be viewed through a variety of lenses. And I don't think that national statistical institutes have the expertise or the competence in ethics. We have the expertise and the competence in data-related issues and in data infrastructures and data classifications and international best practice. But I think the ethical piece is outside it. And just by way of an example of that, we've actually set up an ethics advisory committee within our own for the National Statistical Institute here. It's actually so it's outside of the CSO and provides ethical advice to us. And you know what's driving some of that now is we're now doing things that we never thought we'd have to do before, like asking questions about gender identity, sexual orientation, collecting data from children. You know, looking at, you know, we have a longitudinal survey of children in Ireland, and you're asking them about their first experiences around alcohol, drugs, you know, sexual encounters, all of that really difficult stuff. And the whole piece about the guarantee of confidentiality being provided, you know, to children, and how that sits with children's legislation and the absolute need to protect the child. And you come across something that you see or you hear in those exercises, how does that sit with the statistical confidentiality that's enshrined in statistical legislation? Now, there's a real ethical challenge. And I'm not sure that I certainly don't feel, as the Director General of the CSO, I necessarily have all of the tools to answer that question. And I think it requires expertise, it requires legislative input, but it also requires input from a much broader range of skill sets than I certainly feel we have in the CSO. So I don't know if that answers the question, Gabriel, but I think it's a really good question. But I think it's an emerging question that we do need to consider and we shouldn't shy away from.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick. And let's keep it as an emerging question, right? And maybe we cannot answer it fully now, but I think you gave us a little bit some elements, right? And now, because we're getting slowly towards the end, actually we're already 3 minutes late, but I think that everybody would be happy to stay with us like maybe 15 minutes more. But I would like to give the floor to our senior expert, I mean, Hallgrimr, working for us on the fundamental principles. And could you maybe shortly give us a kind of a summary of the discussion, some of the findings and conclusions, if we had conclusions from your point of view, but also maybe some elements that you had in mind that maybe we have not discussed and should be brought to the attention of the Statistical Commission. Hallgrimr, please.
Thank you. I think it's going to be rather difficult to summarize this discussion. It's been here and there and all over the place, but still there are some common traits. And one is that the fundamental principles are really still very, very relevant, and they are a lighthouse. They are what guides us, etc., etc. There's no disagreement on that. This is emphasized, and I like Patrick's phrasing of we should live with the fundamental principles. I think that has also had much support in the general discussion. Now, the discussion has also brought out the importance of the statistical legislation and the relationship between the fundamental principles, or the fundamental principles as being the base on the statistical legislation. And here I would like to link up with another point which was mentioned, which I believe is very important, and that's the one of coordination. And we find that and I think that's been brought out in the discussion, the importance of coordination within the statistical system in countries, and not only statistical system, but also with data providers and so on and so forth. So absolutely, as Patrick emphasized, we have been coordinating much more than, strictly speaking, the national statistical system. And I think, for instance, a point which was not mentioned, but I think is worth mentioning, I think the fundamental principles have in fact been very, very important for the collection and compilation of the sustainable development indicators, because they touch on so many of the fundamental principles, like professional independence, like coordination, etc. We've seen through the compilation of the indicators the importance of coordination within the countries between the different authorities which deal with the data that we need for the indicators. Okay. As for the monitoring, that was mentioned as a problem, and that of course has been acknowledged as a problem for a long time. Now, what has been done by the Statistical Commission on three occasions in the past is to have a survey of implementation, or survey on compliance with the fundamental principles, survey among countries. And unfortunately, well, this has probably had the value of, or definitely had the value of raising the issue and let's say focusing on this issue of implementation, etc. But countries haven't really responded particularly well to these, and it's a question of whether this is a good instrument for raising awareness of the fundamental principles. Participation has been very low. Last time it was less than 50% of countries that replied. Also, the work involved in responding to this questionnaire was something like between 5 and 6 hours per participant, and that's rather a burden, I think, and many will shy away from it. So question is, what else can we do? Should we continue with this kind of surveying based on self-assessment of the implementation, or can we do something else? And what has been discussed is then, okay, can we go more directly in for taking stock of the situation? The idea, I think, is the UNSD and with the regional commissions, the statistical divisions of the regional commissions, they might take stock of the situation in their different regions and try to focus on problems of implementations, not with the aim of producing a shame list, but with the aim of building a kind of a base for a support to the countries that are found to be lacking in their implementation of the principles. Now, it came out in the discussion that it's unlikely that it's the statisticians that are lacking when it comes to the implementation. It is probably the authorities and the kind of general, well, let's say, environment. I very much like the idea which was, or notion that was brought out, that we should really need the users to own the principles and so on and so forth. Now, the users, the main user, of course, in most countries are the governments. So how can we bring the governments to understand the importance and value of let's say, well, living the fundamental principles and following them? So that is a kind of that's a challenge, I think. So question is, with this kind of stock taking, will that help us to start resolving that problem? Another idea which has been brought out is perhaps is this occasion now when we are celebrating these anniversaries to have some kind of a board of advisors under the auspices of the Statistical Commission that could use the data brought out, the information brought out by the UNST and the regional commissions on compliance and implementation, and this board could try to somehow advise on implementation and even advise countries on implementation, perhaps through the regional commissions or something, some kind of mechanism of that kind. Apart from this, I don't think there is much to be added. Of course, being this 2024 being an anniversary year, we should all envisage to have some kind of an anniversary program around the Statistical Commission meeting. Hopefully it will meet in person, and Stefan, but not otherwise it's rather sort of becomes a mute thing, right? Anyway, so we should envisage some kind of a program that we could use to let's say, sharpen the focus on the importance of the fundamental principles and the implementation of the principles. I think I stop here, Gabriel, unless you can remind me that I have missed something altogether.
No, it should be the other way around, Hallgrimur. But I mean, no, thank you very much. It was very, very good. And I also propose that we don't open the discussion now. I think this is very, very good. Thank you, Hallgrimur. Very, very good input. And we have to bring this with us to the next Statistical Commission already, this one in 2023. And that's the point, right? This webinar is in the series. Yeah, wait 2 seconds and then I let you. Yes. Wait a second. And then we can discuss further. I know the connection is not very good, and then we can discuss these points further. But please, Hallgrimur, you want to add something?
Just one point which I missed, and that is a few years ago, well, it's almost 10 years ago, I think, there were guidelines developed for the implementation of the fundamental principles, and the guidelines have been developed through the years, and they have been added to, and I don't know, they are now rather ungainly. They are very bulky. They are rather ungainly. So I have proposed that this might be a good opportunity to go back to the implementation guidelines and see if we can use them for turning them, not abandoning them at all, but turning them somehow into instruments of advocacy. for the fundamental principles, shortening them and coming up with some instruments that the countries can use or NSOs can use or something like that. So using them for advocacy purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hallgrímur. Yes, to complement or to slightly modify and complement also these guidelines, maybe with awareness and advocacy material that could be shared with our decision makers, so that they understand really what is the advantages of the fundamental principles for them, for the users, and not only just for us. Thank you very much. Before going the floor, I mean the last word to Stefan, of course, as a director of the UN Statistical Division. I would like to thank Ola, Laura, Marco, Misha, and Hallgrímur and Padraig for their contribution. It was fun to work together. I just wanted to tell you that I started statistics in '91, and I was working for the Swiss Statistical Office. My boss was the chair of the Conference of European Statisticians, and Switzerland was the first country that was actually assessed against the principles. It was done by Statistics Canada. And as a junior statistician, because it's a tradition that you invite also the junior statistician to discuss a little bit about this principle, I was invited in the room and I saw these monuments of statistics there in the room discussing the principles.
Dinosaurs.
And since that day, the dinosaurs, yeah.
Dinosaurs.
And since that day, I fell in love with the fundamental principles, and it was really fun to be with all of you here. Thank you very much, Stefan. I would like maybe also to thank Clarence, to thank Linda, to thank Alex, and many others also in the division that helped us to have such a beautiful moment. Thank you very much, Stefan. The last word to you.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, and all the panelists and everybody who participated also in the chat in the background. It was indeed fun. It is not only important, I think it was also a fun moment, and I really enjoyed the interaction and the exchanges. A couple of points that I noticed. I mean, first of all, the principles are for all. That is very important. I think it was interesting also from a historical point of view to see that the principles were developed for a small group of countries at the beginning, in a way, for the transition countries, and it became very quickly clear that they're for all countries. I mean, even the highly developed countries. I remember a conversation that one of the countries that was actually sitting at the table drafting the principles for other countries said, I never expected that the principles would one day become important in my own big developed Western country, and I have to take them to my own government to remind them that we signed up to them. So they are for all countries and not only for developing countries. They are truly global public good. I think I felt. Thank you all for making me feel good to work at the UN. It's a pleasure to be at the UN because we have the ability to connect everybody, to connect you, to have a conversation between Paraguay, Argentina, and the Seychelles about new statistical law, and we can do more. We can share not only the laws themselves, but also perhaps the communication around the law, and that we can really be a professional community of solidarity. And I'm happy to even go further. I had one interesting professional moment also because I was asked by one country that introduced new statistical legislation that had a very strong element of statistical independence written into it, and they had to get out from underneath a line ministry, and I had the chief statistician call me and say, can you talk to my minister and explain to the minister that this is not a secession war, we are not against being in this particular ministry. This is part of a much bigger global movement of making statistics and data better and stronger, and statistical systems better and stronger. So I'm happy as a United Nations also to play that role and bring in advocacy into countries if this is useful and needed in the communication. So I wanted to really, and the one other point that I wrote down is celebration is always also a little bit about making noise. So let's make some noise, communicate our principles, be a little bit more assertive. We are good, dutiful statisticians, but I mean, we have something to show. and we want to do that. And my grandfather always said to me, do good and talk about it. In that order. First, do good, and then you can talk about it. But the second part is important too. So let's follow that fundamental principle of my grandfather and use the celebrations also to advertise what we have, and that is something precious. So I really very grateful to the panelists. You have been very passionate panelists, I wrote down. I mean, you are true ambassadors of the fundamental principles. And there's something else I learned from an ex-boss who said, no good deed goes unpunished. So I have your names and your telephone numbers and your email addresses. As we are entering a year of celebrations, I'd be very happy to be in touch with you and many more around the world. And there were lots of people in the room, and I have to apologize that we were perhaps not so much able in this particular event to bring you in, but this is not the last chance. This is the opening, as I said. This is the beginning of a journey. And in a way, the fundamental principles are an ongoing journey. They are an ongoing challenge for all of us. So please, thank you for being active in the chat. Please stay with us, be connected. We will discuss all these issues at the next forthcoming Statistical Commission meeting. We will have more events. And if you have any ideas of how you think you could contribute or things that could or should be done, please be in touch with us. We are going to have a celebration committee in UNSD that will pull all of the good ideas that we collect from all over the world together and try to translate it into action, as somebody said. So thank you very much to the panelists, to my team, to Gabriel, who we all found out today is a fundamental principle baby, born into the fundamental principles. Thank you to my team in the background. Thank you to all of you for connecting. And let's just stay connected on this really important topic. Thank you and have a good day around the world.